So these are the research questions as John Paul shared, and there's the second one that we've been working on in sub-project 2. How can we understand the extent and nature of the experience of beginning teachers as to how knowledge works in the science religion encounters in the classroom, and how this impacts their confidence and competence. So I'm particularly interested, I had to say, in the competence and competence of beginning teachers. And we use this slightly fudgy phrase about beginning teachers because we're interested in student teachers, those who are in the universities. We're coming across some school direct students who are also linked in with universities, but also we're interested in NQTs and maybe teachers in their second year. So this whole idea of beginning teachers, and that gives us some options, basically. So if you go on to the next slide, please, Bob. So this grid actually shows the first 2 years out of the next 3, and highlighted in orange are how we're doing with our tasks. So there are 2 major things that we are trying to do within sub-project 2 to explore the confidence and competence of beginning teachers, looking at science and religion encounters. And the first is focus groups for 150 beginning teachers, mostly through the universities. And that we have promised to work with 6 different universities on that. And then what we're going to use those focus groups for primarily is to organise a large-scale online survey of beginning teachers, and we're hoping to reach 1,000 beginning teachers in that online survey. So you can see from that grid in front of you, which I'm now looking at on my phone, so it's incredibly tiny, but that we have been quite busy over this year looking at how to organise the ethics around this, recruiting the different universities, which we've managed to complete, and beginning designing the protocol we're going to use with the focus groups. We did 3 live face-to-face pilot focus groups, really, with Christchurch students before lockdown started. And then we've rejigged everything to work with online focus groups, which we think is working reasonably well, actually. It's been perhaps a little bit harder to contact the individual students and get them in, but we're working on that so far. So if you go on to the next one, please, Bob. So in terms of the protocol, what are we trying to find out from these students? Well, we devised something to start with, and this has developed a little as we've kind of gone through the pilots and talked about the pilots. So because we're using this to try and work through what we're going to ask in the big online survey, one of the important things has been to look at their current teaching experience, especially, if you like, in the COVID era, because some of the primary education students, have done 4 weeks in school, and that's it. And most of that is observation, and some of them haven't yet actually taught a science lesson or an RE lesson, or even observed an RE lesson in a primary school, right up to school direct students who've been on the PGCE and have been in school teaching science or RE every day since September. So there's really quite a range. And beyond that, we're finding quite a range in background as well, from the science teacher, the person with a sports science degree who then becomes a minister, who then decides to train as an RE teacher, or the person who becomes does a nursing degree and becomes a child nurse and then decides to train as a science teacher, but has actually got previous teaching experience of PSHE. So it's quite interesting to explore what people's backgrounds are before they arrive in these classrooms to teach these children, because obviously that's going to affect their planning decisions and so on. We've developed this second question really in response to what they've been saying to us, that I was finding in coding the first, we're using NVivo like John Paul, but we're not doing video analysis. But we were finding that lots of people were kind of dancing around this issue, epistemic issue, if you like, about the purpose of their subject or the purpose of the other subject. And so we decided to ask them straight out what they believed the purpose of RE was and what they believed the purpose of science was. And so in the more recent focus groups, we're beginning to get some more direct data on that. And then their experience, what have they actually either observed or taught in this area? And again, there's a vast range from the absolutely nothing, never considered these 2 subjects going together until your email popped into my inbox, to yes, this is absolutely the reason why I want to be an RE teacher, and I've worked in close contact with a science teacher all the way through my PGCE so that I can develop how I teach in this area. So completely contrasting experiences. And what they think then, which I think could be quite different, what they feel is their ideal area, what they would like to teach in this area. So they might have prior ideas or beliefs that lead them to want to do something in this area. But there are constraints, as we all know, there are constraints in schooling environments, especially when you're a student teacher and maybe having to keep to a particular scheme of work or specification, and so on. So what would they like? What would they like to do, and what are the constraints that are facing them? We're interested in their confidence and how confident they feel, how prepared they feel to teach in this area. And as part of that, we've asked them where they go for support. And it's interesting to us as people who are all involved in teacher education that very few of them say, oh, to my mentor or to my university tutor. There's a little bit more of that coming out in recent focus groups, but it doesn't seem to be the immediate answer, which I think we had expected. Again, in the early pilot ones, we found that they were kind of dancing around these sensitive issues. And so we started to ask them whether they thought there were particularly sensitive or perhaps controversial issues that they have to deal with in the area of science and religion. And part of that is how they respond, how prepared they feel to respond to particular pupils with particular ideas and so on. And then we've asked them directly about their personal beliefs and educational experiences and whether they feel that that has any impact on their approach towards this. And then I was a little bit concerned that, especially perhaps with science teachers coming into the focus group, I remember doing this one with Bob observing and saying, look, Mary, you know, that we got science teachers who are interested in religion. And it's like, well, that's because they're the ones that signed up, you know, so are we by virtue of what we're asking people to sign up to, getting the people who are already interested in doing something along these lines? And so we asked them what has motivated them to sign up to the focus group so that we can kind of try to plan around that. And one of the things that we found is that the £10 Amazon voucher is quite a good reason to sign up for a focus group. So that's been useful to us to find out, because if we're in terms of recruiting online, it's putting this up front rather than only telling them about it afterwards. So if you move, Bob, to the next slide for me. We're in the earliest stages of coding this. This project sits slightly behind sub-project 1. Or one thing I was going to say in terms of the links between the two sub-projects is in our earliest focus groups, Caroline and I, well, Caroline's particularly a primary practitioner and was concerned that the primary students that she's worked with might not have enough to say in this area. So we decided that we would trial using some clips from the video footage that John Paul had collected and put those into our focus groups to help the student teachers talk about this area and to see how they responded to the video clips. That has proved more difficult to do online. So we did try one focus group where they, or a couple of focus groups where they came into the focus group online, and then we sent them away to watch the video clip, and then we hoped that they would return to the focus group again after the video clip to tell us what they thought about it. So there have been some issues around that, and we just moved away more recently from using those video clips because we felt that in looking at the data that they were almost distracted into talking about the video clip rather than talking about their own experience. And for example, because we've only got primary video clips so far, the secondary teachers were commenting more on, oh, look what happens in a primary school, than they were on, this is what I think about the teaching of science and religion in this area. So these notes tend to focus that I'm presenting here on about the first 3 or 4 focus groups that we've done, because the others we've all done in about the last week or 2, and we haven't got transcripts and everything through from those yet. So it's quite interesting to look at some of the perceived. This slide doesn't really show you what they believe is the difference in the subject, and I know I need more work transcribing and careful coding on that, but just some of the offerings that they've given on what they believe the purpose of RE is. And again, at the moment, that tends to be RE teachers talking about the purpose of RE, and a variety of people talking about the purpose of science. But you can see some of those emerging, and I think we'll end up with a lot more. There's a lot more variety than is shown in that slide really coming through in our recent focus groups. But you do still have this perception that science teaches the facts and that RE is about opinions. So there is this kind of dichotomizing in the whole notion of what they believe the subject is for, and that's not going to help if you then want to see how compatible these are going to be. It's not always like that. I mean, we had this amazing student we were talking to the other day who was talking, some of the final comments there were from her. She wants to explore, she thinks RE is about exploring differences in terms of systems of belief, but she's particularly talking about the use of the term evidence there, whereas she then was able to say that she felt science was more about an empirical and mathematical form of evidence. So, and she was the one also that talked about developing this elastic way of thinking, and that how she felt that might apply to both subjects until more evidence emerges. So it was interesting to hear from her, but she had a great deal of subject knowledge quite clearly from both areas. It was coming at it from a philosophical angle. So different things we get, again, always a vast range. Bob, next slide, please. So one of the things that I'm coding to is when they talk about the relationships between RE and science, and just how they're not necessarily explicit about these, but sometimes they are. Of course, there is clearly the dichotomy of, you know, these two are at opposite ends and they have nothing to do with each other, or there's comparison being made. In some are coming through with the evidence of dialogue. And again, dialogue has a variety behind it. So some are able to say, well, look, the dialogue is, I've worked with this science teacher. I was able to get him into the classroom to talk about the Big Bang and so on, and to add detail and to talk to the science department in how I was planning. But I have to say that is quite rare so far in what we've heard. And it's more a case of, well, I might have approached the science department, but I just know they're not interested in RE. So I think at the moment, it's fairest to say that there's a range of approaches out there. Quite a lot looked at historical examples. The science teachers were able to say, I warm to that as a history teacher, but they look at the historical examples, and we've seen the, oh yeah, this, so somebody said, yes, I did bring religion into my science debate about why we haven't gone forward with a particular form of research. And of course, it's the religious people, they've been holding it back. So there is evidence there that sometimes when religion is brought into the science classroom, it's brought in as an example of a hindrance. And again, it's not always the case, but I know there's lots of examples of that in the history classroom as well. And then we have found with the Christchurch students that we piloted on, that they were very much encouraged over the last year of their PGCEs to do a lot of collaboration with another subject. And some had specifically chosen to collaborate between science and RE. So there's some examples coming through of that. Okay, next slide, please, Bob. So I was interested in terms of how we do the online survey of just noting down any topic raised by the students of where they feel there is an encounter between science and religion. So I think you can probably look through those for yourself. Again, there's a range, and some moves towards the more ethical side of RE. I think a few of the examples from the primary school were about stewardship and climate change and so on. But by far, if I was as clever as John Paul, you see, I've been able to share my coding with you, but it's on a different computer. But by far, the most common ones that are coming up there are the Big Bang and creation stories and how those are taught. Okay, next, please, Bob. In my own doctoral research and so on, I'm particularly interested on some of the constraints that act on teachers. I'm actually interested in experienced teachers at the other end of the scale. But I do think there's a lot of research around constraints and affordances and what helps teachers to teach what they want to do and what actually holds them back. And that really comes through in the discourse here in what we're looking at, whether it's the culture of assessment, I have to teach to that specification, or the culture of the school, well, no, we don't talk to them because they're in a completely different building, or the danger of confusion, I wouldn't want to do that because that might confuse the pupils, or definitely the lack of confidence of some of the teachers, but how far that's linked to a lack of either religious or scientific knowledge, lack of time, negative views of religion come through to some extent, and concerns, I think more from the primary school teachers that we talk to, concerns over parents' reactions. One interesting little point, somebody said they had watched experienced teachers limit pupils' questions. So when the pupil asks a big and difficult question, the student teacher observes that the teacher tends to shut that down and say, no, we haven't got time for that now. And it might be the case that the beginning teacher doesn't recognise that pupil always asks that type of question to try and move away from whatever work they're supposed to be doing that day. But at the same time, it was interesting that they had that experience, that they felt that the larger scale questions are being shut down in the classroom because of probably a priority of moving on with the specification. I have a quote there, which I don't think I can read. Oh yeah, I can enlarge it actually. It does relate back to S's idea of not being a scientist. If the kids have a different question that's more scientific related, so they might want to know more than we've prepared as RE teachers, it's difficult almost having the kids respect you for being this source of knowledge in the room and then saying, I don't know. So if it's once, it's fine. But it's when they're really interested about how science and religion does work, you get 6 hands up. And if you say to all 6 of them, I don't know, I don't know. So there is a teacher who's lacking confidence in coming forward. I have to say, in terms of variety, there's also student teachers who say, I'm very happy to say I don't know because it's not my role to know everything. And I've got pupils who come in and give me answers. So there's real variety there, but I recognise that as a kind of a typical voice, if you like, of a student teacher not wanting to share their lack of knowledge with their pupils, and perhaps fearing the consequences of that. And the next slide, please, Bob. Okay, so this brings us to kind of early stage conclusions. I mean, there's so many different ways that we could go with this, but it seems that different approaches emerge from science, RE and primary teachers, and more could be done to challenge perceptions of the other subject, perhaps with beginning teachers. And it could be interesting to see from the literature if more experienced teachers have a different perception of the other. There were significant constraints acting on innovation in this area. Where subject knowledge and competence are strong, there is some excellent practice in evidence in terms of the teachers relating their own practice. And it's too early to say, but there did seem to be a correlation between those who, it's something for the online survey, but it'll be interesting to see whether those who judge their subject knowledge to be less, therefore feel they're less able to innovate in this area, or whether the differences could be true, because sometimes the more you know, the more aware you are of your lack of knowledge. So it's messy. There are questions over the language. Deborah's been doing a linguistic analysis of the data we have so far, and it's some interesting gaps in there. Like there's not much use of terms like proof. There's not much use of terms like evidence. So why aren't these student teachers using the language we'd expect them to use to talk about their subjects? And I'm interested in, as we move on to the next stage, collecting more data, but also looking at this large online survey, what we would like to see emerge from that.
Okay, so that gives you a flavour of the project. If you'd like more information, then you can get in touch with us by emailing nicer, N-I-C-E-R, at canterbury.ac.uk, or by searching for me, bob.bowie, at canterbury.ac.uk. Thank you very much for watching the video.